All right, welcome back. Last week we started learning about this concept known as due process. We know that it is embedded in what two amendments? Take a moment to write it down. You don't have notes out. This is a good chance. That's right, the 5th and 14th Amendments. Very good. But we also know that the term due process is a little vague. The law applies due process in two ways: procedural due process and substantive due process. Our objective for today is to define due process and trace the way it protects a person going through the criminal justice system. This corresponds with pages 276 to 286 in your textbook. To do that, I'm going to ask you to do something a little different. You are going to need a blank piece of paper, preferably without lines. I've got my sketchbook here. Yeah, you may have guessed it. We are going to be drawing. The more accurate term really is doodling. Don't freak out if you don't think you're a good artist. This is just to get our brain thinking about the material in a different way. You can diagram, you can flowchart, you can draw. Just take notes. It's up to you. Ready? Okay, I've got my paper. I'm ready to go. Procedural due process is the manner in which the law is carried out. And I'm going to put that definition up on the screen so that you can write it down. Because the law gets carried out by police or law enforcement, again, that idea of the executive branch executing the law, I am going to start this process with a crime. So you can kind of see my kerpow thought bubble, because not exclusively, but most often, procedural due process kicks in when a crime is committed. Again, it's not to say you don't have due process rights at other times, but as we can see by this sneaky guy I'm adding to show you crime is serious, that is where we tend to start. As soon as that crime is committed, the police start looking for clues. They are looking to solve the crime or arrest the perpetrator, and so they are going to start to look around the crime scene, interview people, etc. So I've got my crime. We're going to start the procedure. You can see I'm drawing a magnifying glass to indicate that they are looking for clues, but at this point, they need to start following certain rules or certain procedures. Get it? Procedures, due process, following certain procedures, procedural due process. Definition is in the name. We know from TV and from other pop culture references that there are a lot of rules that they have to follow. So I'm turning my detective, giving kind of a Sherlock Holmes hat, like a deer stalker. And one of which are limits on what they can search and what they can seize. And this is protected by the 4th Amendment. So you can see I'm really emphasizing that the arm and with the magnifying glass and the body look like a 4. That is because the 4th Amendment protects you from unreasonable search and seizure. He has to get a warrant, so that's what we're going to add down here at the bottom. Big question I know a lot of you have is, with procedural due process, what's to stop the police from doing it anyway, from doing that search and seizure without that warrant that we see at the bottom of our diagram? This comes from a really helpful check from a case in 1914 called the Exclusionary Rule. This is in case the police, like our guy over there, our 4th Amendment guy, find anything without a warrant or without procedural due process, it cannot be used if that piece of evidence cannot be used if it goes to trial. The evidence is excluded. This has another really cool, ominous name called the fruit of the poisoned tree, meaning that if something goes wrong early at the root of the investigation, it poisons the whole investigation. So I'm going to put a tree here that has the root at the evidence. You can see it near the warrant, and then it's going to go on to encompass our whole investigation with the exclusionary rule. And the steps that we're about to take still fall under procedural due process, so they're still in some ways encompassed by this fruit of the poison tree metaphor. Doing something wrong early on can poison the whole investigation. My favorite example of this, you may have heard me talk about it in class, is of Dalrymple map. Dalrymple had made some questionable dating choices in the past. So the police were looking for a fugitive. They went to her house. They asked her if they could come in. She replied, "You got a warrant?" They barged in anyway. And when they found obscene material, aka some kind of racy comic books, they tried to arrest her. She argued that they didn't have the right to come in, and the comic books couldn't be used in a trial against her. This is incidentally the case that incorporated the Fourth Amendment for a handy tie-in to selective incorporation, Mapp v. Ohio in 1961. Again, not one of our key cases, just a good one to know. Once they find the evidence they were looking for, they make an arrest. This is where what amendment kicks in? The Fifth. Good. So an example of this is the case of Ernesto Miranda. He was arrested for kidnapping and raping a young girl in Arizona, a young woman, and he spent 2 hours in police questioning, and they got him to confess. And the whole of the conviction ultimately rested on that confession. So you see our police with his deerstalker hat and a guy at a table, and he's forcing that guy to confess. The problem: when does your Fifth Amendment protection against self-incrimination kick in? The Supreme Court says that the minute a person is taken into custody and questioned by police, the Fifth Amendment kicks in. So I'm going to sit him on a 5 on the Fifth Amendment to show that he should have his Fifth Amendment protections, and I'm going to put an X through that speech bubble because he does not have to speak unless he wants to. And this is the first of what is known as the Miranda Rights, which is what you will hear a lot of times on those TV procedural shows. You have the right to remain silent. The second of those rights is once you've been arrested and charged, the procedural due process of Miranda Rights says you have the right to an attorney, and if you can't afford one, one will be provided for you. This is emphasized in one of our key court cases. So I'm going to draw a guy in jail because he's been charged. You'll notice he's in the number 6 because this is when your Sixth Amendment is most prevalent. And this man, Clarence Gideon, was a poor man who was accused of robbing essentially a jukebox. He had some previous criminal history, and on that, combined with his other aspects, he was charged with several years in prison. But because it was a Florida state law, they did not give him a lawyer. Sitting in the jail library, he does his research, he writes out a petition of certiorari, there's a good vocabulary word, certiorari, and he gets his case before the Supreme Court, who rules in his favor. If we are really going to have procedural due process, everyone should have the right to an attorney, whether that's a federal crime, before we had a selective incorporation, but also state and local crimes. So the lawyer is there to protect you. I'm going to draw him in front of the 6th, and he is going to stand in for that selective incorporation of the 6th Amendment with Gideon v. Wainwright. I'm adding my jury to the 7th Amendment, although really it belongs to the 6th and 7th Amendment, the 6th for criminal trial and the 7th for civil trials when one person sues another. But the lawyer is protecting our 6th Amendment, which is one that's going to come up a lot more often. The final stage of the procedure, if a person is found guilty, is the punishment. Even that involves procedural due process. You may have guessed it, this is one you're familiar with, the 8th Amendment protects you from cruel and unusual punishment, but that's been a little bit ill-defined. Sometimes things like torture, big no dispute, except in the case of terrorists, which we can talk about separately. But the death penalty has been ruled cruel and unusual for minors, but not for adults found to be of sound mind. So we're getting some conflicting information about cruel and unusual. I'm going to put my guy back in jail because he's been charged. I'm going to put a little thundercloud over his head for cruel and unusual. Also for electric chair, don't like that. And then I'm going to cross it out because the 8th Amendment protects that part of your procedural due process. And there you have it. You can see we end up with a full diagram of procedural due process. You should have something in your notes which leads you through the steps of a criminal trial and has an amendment attached to each one. Post a picture with your check for understanding, and we'll come back to this question of liberty versus security. Thanks.